I have some dates coming up. I'll be performing Friday, March 21st at Red Bus Brewing in Folsom, California. And then Thursday, April 17th at the Stanislaus County Farm Bureau Dinner, and that's in Turlock. And then Friday, the 18th at Sonora Tap Room, April 18th at Sonora Tap Room in Sonora. So hopefully we'll see you there. We are also brought to you by Tyler & Co. Marketing, providing top-notch photography and videography services to Northern California. Tyler & Co. is your one-stop shop for social media content, product videos, commercials, promotional videos, and best of all, weddings and events. I dare you to take a quick scroll down their Instagram page at TylerandCo_marketing and tell me it doesn't look like a Hollywood production. If you want people to ask you who the executive producer of your wedding was, call Tyler & Co. If you want it to look like you got paid just to be in your wedding photos, call Tyler & Co. If you want the video of your first dance to look like it qualified you for the Screen Actors Guild, call Tyler & Co. And best of all, your future father-in-law is going to forgive you for everything. Everything. When he finds out how much money you're saving him on this wedding by using Tyler & Co. marketing to capture your big day. So visit tylerandcofilms.com for all your photography needs. That's tylerandcofilms.com. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Today, I'm not doing a song of the day. I wanted to tell the story of Graham Parsons, Graham Parsons is one of these guys that after I started digging into some of these little like song of the day history facts, when I stumbled upon Graham Parsons' story, he's somebody that never took off and became crazy famous. Most of his fame came after he died, but during his life, he was this undercurrent bumping into so many different people and so many different stories, and his impact on music is just gigantic, and he's not a name that very many people, have stuck to. But anyway, so Graham Parsons was born in 1946, and kind of another through line here between Graham Parsons, Willie Nelson, and Hank Williams. All of them, their dads were war veterans. So in Willie Nelson and Hank Williams' case, their dads were World War I veterans, but then in this case, Graham Parsons' dad was a World War II veteran, and he was actually kind of famous. So his name was Coondog Connor, and Coondog Connor had a pretty interesting story of his own. So he was at Pearl Harbor when the Japanese attacked on December 7th, 1941, but he wasn't on base. He was staying with his girlfriend at the time. She was like the heiress not Winn-Dixie, but the Woolworth family fortune. They had this giant kind of plantation house in Hawaii, and that's where he was when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. I mean, he wasn't supposed to be on duty. He wasn't like missing or anything, but he was just nice and safe and out of the way. But then he goes on to have a pretty crazy career. He ends up flying like 50 combat missions in the Pacific. And, he's this decorated war hero at the end of the war. And he ends up living in Florida near the Snively, I think it's Snively family. It's not the family farms, but it's like the Snively Citrus, corporation. And he meets Avis Snively. And they get married and, start having, they have one kid. They have Graham Parsons. Or no, they have two kids. It's Graham Parsons and his little sister, little Avis. And so when Coondog Connor gets out of the military, he ends up working for the Snively family. And that goes not great. He goes from, a pretty exciting life. And this is, what's funny is that this is the second, like, super rich woman that he's managed to end up with. But anyway, so they get married. Like a year and a half later, Graham Parsons is born. And Coondog Connor was liked by everybody just about that he ran into, except the Snively family. And so they kind of shuttle him off. They put him in charge of a fruit box plant, like just building the boxes for the citrus that they were picking. And this is a giant, like the Snively, farms was responsible at one point for like a third of the citrus coming out of Florida. Like they're a gigantic, corporation. And Avis was like one of the only heirs to this thing. So they end up shipping Avis and Coondog down to Waycross, Georgia. and he ends up being in charge of the fruit box plant. But him and Avis both were really heavy drinkers. Like alcohol is going to be a through line problem throughout this entire story. So Coondog and Avis move to Waycross, and things just start to deteriorate over time. There's all kind, they're kind of known around town as this like, kind of toxic relationship, but they're kind of the royalty around because they employ everybody. So, Graham is born into this. Then this kind of goes along for, a while. When Graham is 10 years old, Elvis Presley comes to town and plays in like their local, music hall. And supposedly, I mean, I haven't found this confirmed anywhere, but it's like rumored that Graham got to meet Elvis after the show, and it was like a light switch went off. He was a different kid the next day, and he's like just super into rock and roll, super into music, and he kind of starts to pick the guitar up. And so, I mean, he just bumps into Elvis, and it completely changes him as a person. And so, and it's like, he had a pretty rough home life, so music is a pretty easy thing for kids to pour themselves into, and he does. Well, then, I think like a year and a half later, not even, when Graham is 12, Coondog Connor packs up the family and sends them up to Winter Haven, Florida, which is where like the main Snively, estate was. They had been shipped from there down to Waycross, Georgia, kind of put out of the way. But the main corporation was in Winter Haven. And on December 22nd, Coondog puts his family on a train and sends them off for like Christmas vacation, which that on its own is a giant red flag. Like if dad's putting you on a train and sending you off for Christmas, but he's not going, there's enough tension there. Either things are falling apart between him and Mavis, or he's just not welcome in the Snively house. Like for whatever reason, whatever's going on there, it's the fact that he didn't go is in and of itself a sign that something was really wrong. And so he puts his family on the train, and then Coondog goes home and kills himself the next day. And that's Christmas for Graham. And that, obviously, he's a 12-year-old kid, loses his dad, completely falls apart. And, I shouldn't say that. It's rough for him and the family, and they all deal with that in their respective ways. Now, they go through a lot of change really fast. So, after Coondog dies, the family moves out of Waycross, Georgia, like immediately. Within a few days of the funeral, they all move back to Winter Haven, Florida, and kind of in with the rest of the Snively family. And that's another sign that they had kind of like apparently the fruit box, plant was working fine. They didn't have to shuttle that family off to Georgia, but they did until Coondog was out of the picture. They brought them all back. And so it seems like it's got the fingerprints of toxicity all over it. And, but anyway, so soon afterwards, within a year or two, Avis meets a guy named Bob Parsons. Now, Bob Parsons is this very complex character who is, first of all, for Graham, he becomes a really reliable father figure, and he actually adopts Graham and Avis. Like that's like right off the bat. Of all of his faults that he's accused of throughout the years, he was never accused of being anything but, loving towards Graham and little Avis. So he adopts them right off the bat, and then him and Avis end up having, I think, 2 more daughters of their own. So Graham has 2 half-sisters. And then, and he kind of fills the father role, and that's how Graham gets the last name Parsons. But Bob Parsons was also a pretty serious drinker, and so was Avis. So they're peas in a pod in that way. And while, Bob did his best to, fill the father figure role, Graham is still obviously super affected by losing his dad at a young age. He ends up going to like a military prep school, which he basically, he had a pretty rough go. Now, the other thing about this is that, you have to understand that Graham Parsons already knows that he's the heir to a giant fortune. So he's a trust fund kid. Money has never been an issue at this point. And that's why Bob Parsons, the Snively people didn't like Bob Parsons either, because they were really sure that he was just marrying Avis to get into the family fortune. And, that was their opinion. And then Avis ends up, Graham's mom, Avis, ends up in the hospital from alcohol problems, like sclerosis of the liver, I guess. And this is where things get a little bit dicey, because Graham is off at, this is still technically like high school, is the prep school that he went to. The day he graduates, his mom dies in the hospital. And there's a few questions about exactly how that went down, because Bob Parsons comes and visits Avis in the hospital. As soon as he leaves, like within moments, she's dead. And then that, like, you know, it wasn't like a giant shock to everybody. Obviously, she was in the hospital, and this is in the, you know, the late 50s, so their ability to get a handle on this stuff was pretty limited. But within moments of Bob leaving, she dies. And then kind of the rumor mill gets kind of going about, like, did he poison her, or did, like, what, you know, all kinds of rumors start flying around. But that doesn't seem to affect Graham too much initially. He just knows that his mom died. I will say, though, soon afterwards, like within, I think, months, Bob Parsons marries the 18-year-old babysitter who was taking care of the two younger daughters at the time. So there's a little bit of sketchiness around Avis's death. She was a severe alcoholic, and, you know, that was not a unforeseeable end to that deal. But so the day Graham graduates high school, he finds out that his mom died. And obviously that has another gigantic impact on him. But this is, again, where, like, now Avis and Graham are the heirs to the Snively, you know, fortune. And this is, like, there's pretty much nothing in the way of that. Like, Bob has a controlling interest in it now because he was married to Avis, but money's coming into Graham and Avis, like, to where they don't have to worry about it. So he's an 18-year-old kid who just doesn't have to worry about income. He can go do whatever he wants. And at this point already, like, before Avis had died, the family really jumped in and supported Graham's music ambitions. So they had, like, at one point, Bob and Avis bought a club just for Graham to perform in, which was, I mean, that says it all. Like, that, you know, how much money do you have? Where you just be like, oh, I want my son to get lots of reps in, so we just buy him a club. And then, you know, everything that comes with that, they just did it so Graham had somewhere to play. And they had, like, he had a full music setup in his house with, like, a piano and a music room and the whole thing. They were really supportive of his musical ambitions. And so by the time his mom dies, he's already, like, starting bands at his prep school. He's playing around places. And so when he goes off to college, he starts a band called the International Submarine Band, which you can still, you know, find some of their stuff out there. But it's never like a gigantic success. But they're playing, you know, around the college town. And so that goes on for a little while. But Graham flunks out of college, like, pretty quickly. He, you know, doesn't take it seriously. He doesn't have to take it seriously. Flunks out of college and moves. Well, okay, so things start to get exciting here. So he's part of the International Submarine Band. Then Graham takes a trip out to California and would eventually convince the rest of the International Submarine Band to just come out there and join him. I don't think he ever goes back east. So Graham ends up in California. And this is where... So you can imagine this, like, musically talented dude goes to California and is immediately hooked up with the right people somehow. Like, I don't know how this happens, but he ends up at a house party at David Crosby's house, which at the time, David Crosby was a member of the Byrds. He's one of the founding members. And, you know, there doesn't seem to be any other connection between Graham and the Byrds at this stage, but he ends up at a party at David Crosby's house. And immediately proceeds to steal Graham's fiance. Like, she's at the party, Graham just walks up to her, David's fiance. Graham just walks up to her and is like, hits her with, like, the, you know, the pickup lines. I think he said something to her to the effect of, like, I've been looking for you all my life. And she's just like, oh, great. She ends up leaving David Crosby. They were engaged at the time. She breaks that off and ends up going with Graham. She ends up pregnant not long after that. And so they never get married, but they have a daughter who I think her name is Polly Parsons. And so that's going on the side. So it's like his first musical act in California was to swoop David Crosby's girlfriend. And so that, you know, obviously puts a little bit of a reputational, you know, spot on him. But so he the International Submarine Band, they do get a record deal, but it's not super successful. So at this point, now the other thing to know about the Byrds. So the Byrds and Graham Parsons have this like parallel history that is tough to keep track of sometimes, because what happens with the Byrds is they start out with their 5 original founding members. Chris Hillman, David Crosby, Gene Clark, and I have it written down here, but my eyes aren't going to find it fast enough. But basically, and then McGuinn, Roger McGuinn, I think. And McGuinn's the only original member that sticks with the Byrds all through their entire career arc. So everybody else comes and goes kind of depending on the timeline. You can find timelines of the Byrds band makeup online that are, I mean, it's just a crazy, you have to have a graph with like lines touching and going and showing you who was where for what amount of time. And so David Crosby at this point David Crosby, for all of his, talent, is rumored to have been, kind of tough to keep in a band like that for a while. He was very politically outspoken. He was very, as most creative guys have to be, he was he was tough to push around, and he was very set in his opinions. And it had caused a bunch of tension between him and Chris Hillman and a couple other guys. And then they end up playing a show. It was the Monterey Music Festival, or the Monterey Pop Festival is what it was called, where this is where like the bands all kind of touch each other. Like, so Buffalo Springfield was also at that show, but just before that, Buffalo Springfield was experiencing their own kind of turbulence, and Neil Young had quit the band, and he had quit the band like right as they were supposed to leave to go on the Johnny Carson show. He just decided that, he had kind of had enough. And to be fair to Neil Young, like that was, at a time for him, that was the right call for him. He wasn't doing it out of like ego pushes or anything, stuff like that. He was feeling very run down by the road process and by that band. And for his own health, he decided, I'm not doing this. So he leaves the band. Well, that leaves the band a guy short for this Monterey Pop Festival that they're supposed to go do. And Stephen Stills decides, I don't know if he had met David Crosby before that. I believe he had, because they run into each other, and Stephen Stills invites David Crosby to sit in with the Buffalo Springfield set, which was the next day after the Byrds. Well, David Crosby doing that kind of rubs the rest of the Byrds the wrong way. And they were already kind of like, there was a lot of tension, and now he's sitting in with another band, later in the same festival. And so it didn't end immediately, but that was kind of one of the nails in the coffin, where soon after that, David Crosby leaves the Byrds. Just in time for Chris Hillman to run into Graham Parsons in a bank in Beverly Hills. So like David Crosby had just left. And actually the first guy to leave the Byrds was one of the Clarks. So there were actually 2 Clarks in the Byrds. One spells their name with an E at the end and the other one doesn't, and it's super confusing. But so the first one leaves, and let me see if I can find his name here. Let's see here. No. It's Roger McGuinn. Oh, Gene Clark, David Crosby, Chris Hillman, Michael Clark. Michael Clark leaves the Byrds first, and he left because of an anxiety disorder. Like he just couldn't handle the road thing. He was just too anxious about stuff. He was having performance issues, and so he just leaves the Byrds, just pulls his chute and says, "I can't do this anymore." But after Michael Clark left, the Byrds stayed as a quartet for a while. Like they didn't replace him immediately. But then when David Crosby leaves, they got to do something, because they went from 5 down to 3. And Graham Parsons is the guy that they get to replace David Crosby. Now, that, I don't know how much Chris Hillman knew at the time, because the way, if you see Chris Hillman talking about it, he describes it as if he just like ran into Graham Parsons in the bank and just kind of knew of him, that he had never met him before, but kind of ran up to him and was like, "Oh, hey, you're Graham Parsons." And they kind of, hit it off in the bank. But he didn't make it sound like he knew anything about the history, that it was like, he was Graham Parsons, the music guy, not Graham Parsons, the guy that swooped the girlfriend off the band member that you're trying to replace right this second. So I don't know how much that played a role, but Graham Parsons ends up being the guy that replaces David Crosby. And which, I'm sure stung a little bit for David, but like, Anyway, the Byrds continue. And Graham Parsons' role with the Byrds is profound and short-lived because remember, Graham Parsons is a trust fund kid who is very creative and very talented and, very difficult to push around. So when Chris Hillman hires Graham Parsons, he doesn't say like, hey, do you want to come be a member of the Byrds? He says, we need a keyboard player. And, and Graham Parsons, could do that. And so he hires him but he's on salary. So the way the bands work is like, if you got a 5-piece band and all the members are original members, you all get a fifth of whatever money's coming in. And if record sales go up, great. If record sales go down, everybody's pay goes down. Well, if you get hired on salary, you get paid the same no matter what. And you can kind of be hired and fired in that way. Like you're not tied to the success of the band. That's the way that Graham was hired. He was on salary. And even though he has a big, profound effect on the Byrds, and kind of some sources list him as a member, some don't. Graham himself says later that he was never really a member of the Byrds, that he was hired as a piano player or as a keyboard player. And so they proceed. Okay, so Roger McGuinn had this idea for an album where he wanted to start off kind of like a music history album where he was going to start with like old kind of folk music, ratchet through some country music and everything else, jazz and everything, and land on like the most current electronic type of music. And this is the 60s, so like electronic for the time. And that was his kind of, and it wasn't all him writing those songs. It was like, they're doing lots of covers across this arc, but that was the plan. They started work on this album. Well, Graham Parsons proceeds to completely railroad the entire thing, but they kind of let him because Graham was really talented and he had a really good ear for music. And Graham's thing was that he was a country music guy when it wasn't really that cool to be a country music guy yet. It was like, it's kind of the way folk music now is experiencing this like resurgence where suddenly it's like all the good music is these kind of underground folk guys. Where it's like, now we've got the like Charlie Crockett's and the Benjamin Todds and guys like that are like really talented, but they aren't super. It's kind of cool to know who they are. That's how Graham Parsons was about country music. It was this hip new age guy, but he was passionate about, you got to check out George Jones and Merle Haggard and these, so he had this passion about country music behind him, even at a time it wasn't that cool yet. And Graham Parsons was a big part of making it cool again. And so he proceeds to basically just railroad this Byrds album into being a country album. Like they completely scrap the music timeline plan and they end up with an album called Sweetheart of the Rodeo, which if you listen to that album, it is 100% a country album. It doesn't even sound like the Byrds. Like it's almost like, if you listen to like Tambourine Man and earlier Byrds album, and then you hear Sweetheart of the Rodeo, it's a different band and it's a different sound. And that's because of Graham Parsons. Like that was 100% his deal. And they included 3 songs that he wrote on that album. The most famous of which is Hickory Wind, which is still a great song. And so they joked later that like they meant to hire a keyboard, but they accidentally hired George Jones in a rhinestone suit. Like that was Graham Parsons. And so they go through, they make this album. It's just got Graham Parsons' fingerprints all over it. He basically just completely took over and orchestrated this whole thing. Then later, somehow there was like a contractual dispute between record labels. And for some of the songs, but not all of them for some reason, McGuinn had to go back and take Graham Parsons' vocals out of the lead. So Graham Parsons sang lead, I think originally on like 7 songs, I think. And he ends up, now there's only the 3 that I think are the ones that he wrote that he's singing lead on. But they're still on the same album, but there was some kind of contractual problem where McGuinn had to later go back and change everything. And Graham Parsons would later say that, like, he basically effed it up. And, that bugged Graham Parsons for the rest of his life. That was, having his lead vocals scrapped off that album for most of it anyway. But it's still, like I said, he's still singing lead on those other 3 songs. So I'm not exactly sure how that worked contractually, but whatever. So they proceed to go on tour. And when the Byrds go on tour, like Graham Parsons takes to that like a fish to water. Like he's total rock star mode. Everybody's drinking. Everybody's on drugs. It is just a wild party the whole time. And it's supposed to be this world tour where they, they go through England and they end up, they were supposed to go to South Africa. And remember, Graham Parsons has only been with the Byrds for a few months at this point. He literally just joined, made the album, they go on tour in the course of a few months. And they get to England, and this is where Graham Parsons meets, don't fail me now, brain, the Rolling Stones, so Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, geez Louise. He meets Keith Richards, who's a gigantic part of this story, and I'm embarrassed that I tripped on that just now. But so Graham Parsons and Keith Richards become friends immediately. Like they're just they see each other, they hit it off, and Keith Richards would later describe that meeting as meeting a friend that he'd known forever, and they just clicked immediately. And that day, it was literally the day of, they meet the Rolling Stones, they start hanging out. Graham and Keith hit it off, and in their side conversations, this is where we have a little bit of a split in storytelling, where if you listen to Keith and what would have been Graham's side of the story, Keith and Graham go off, start having a conversation. And Graham starts asking Keith about South Africa because that was the next stop on the tour. And Keith and the Stones had been there. And Graham was kind of like, what's that like? And he wasn't, he wasn't morally, he was super opposed to playing segregated shows. That was not part of his, moral makeup. And, he tells Keith, they said we're playing mixed shows, but I don't know if that's true. And Keith basically tells him that's not they don't do that in South Africa. If you go to South Africa, you're playing segregated shows. And so right then in that moment, Graham Parsons is like, well, I'm not going. I'm not doing that then. If we're getting tricked into this, I'm not doing it. And spoken like a true guy who has money coming in, right? He's not worried about the money from this tour. He's got his trust fund still. He sees something he doesn't like, pulls his chute, I'm not going. Which obviously pissed off the rest of the Byrds, because if you listen to Chris Hillman's version of the story, because Chris Hillman and the rest of the Byrds continue on to South Africa, and they do play that show, and they replace Graham with one of the roadies, just one of the dudes that was carrying stuff around. They're like, you're in. He could kind of play keyboard, and the rest of the tour is a disaster. But at the time, Hillman maintains that the only reason Graham didn't go to South Africa is because he wanted to stay with Keith Richards, which I don't know if that's, how much water that holds, because he did stay with Keith Richards for a long time, and they did become close, and that relationship did cause issues later. But at the time, it seems like that decision getting made that quick, it was sort of a moral stance that he was taking. And because the rest of the tour went so badly, I think that is more likely than just, he wanted to hang out with Keith Richards and do whatever drugs were around. So the Byrds continue on. They finish this tour, and it's a dumpster fire. To the point where, Chris Hillman is the one that fires Graham and says, all right, you're out of the Byrds, man. That's done deal. So, but that tour goes so bad, it causes a bunch of issues for the Byrds anyway. The band struggles to survive that thing. And so Graham ends up back in LA. He goes back to his family, and Chris Hillman ends up back in LA after the tour. And Chris Hillman says that within a couple of months, they had everybody had made up. They were all friends again, even though Graham wasn't in the Byrds. And I think the rest of the Byrds were kind of relieved anyway, because he was such a strong personality and he was so over the top, and he became a front man when they meant to hire a keyboardist. And so that was a change that seemed to have been kind of coming for a while anyway. But so the problems with the rest of that tour lead Chris Hillman to leave the Byrds, which that was a huge problem for them. So Chris gets out of the Byrds, and then him and Graham end up starting the Flying Burrito Brothers, which is now the Flying Burrito Brothers and the Byrds will just kind of run next to each other, swapping members sort of for a while. That's a really confusing graph to look at. It's the members of the Byrds and the members of the Flying Burrito Brothers and who was where when. Because anyway, so they start the Flying Burrito Brothers, and because each of the members of the Flying Burrito Brothers kind of had a name already, they experience some success relatively quick. They get a record deal almost immediately. And they were even like making these crazy demands about like amenities and stuff on tour. Like they hadn't even released an album yet. They were just kind of playing shows and but because the individual guys had a reputation, they were kind of fired right into success on the music front. And so the Flying Burrito Brothers, they get their album put together and they go on tour, which, by all accounts, was a disaster. They called it the train tour. So basically it was Graham's idea. Oh, and this is also, at this stage in the story, there's another character that shows up, a guy named Phil Kaufman. And Phil Kaufman becomes very important later in the story, but right now he's the road manager. So basically he was working for the Rolling Stones, just as a roadie, I guess, and he meets Graham Parsons, and he's an American guy. So when Graham gets back to California, he hires Phil Kaufman to be the road manager, who at the time, Phil had no idea what a road manager did. It wasn't like he was super qualified. He was just a roadie from before, but now Graham is like, you're my guy. You want to manage this whole tour for us, which Phil Kaufman later described that first tour as just a game of hide the drugs. Like it was them on the Flying Burrito Brothers on a train, and Phil Kaufman just herding cats, keeping everybody alive, and then like hiding drugs, and they were looking for the drug, and then he would take them away from people or like dole them out at like reasonable rates or whatever. Like it was just a nightmare of a tour, according to Phil Kaufman. And to the point where like at one point, there are other people on this train. This is not just like they got their own train and rode across the country. The Flying Burrito Brothers just bought train tickets. And so they're with the general public, and they're just being rock stars the whole time. They're just loud. They're drunk. They're high. They're doing the whole rock star thing. And they're enclosed in a metal tube with a few other members of the public, to the point where like one of the guys that worked for the railroad solves this problem by like kind of stroking their egos a little bit. And he kind of goes up to him and he's like, listen, I know you rock star types don't want us bothering you for your autographs. So how about I'll hook you up and I'll put you in this private dining car. And they're like, yeah, that sounds like a great idea, because they, we don't want to be bothered or whatever. And they shuttle him off into this private dining car. And that's the only way that the rest of the people on this train experience any peace the whole time, because these guys were just coming unglued. And, Phil says that deep down, they all kind of knew what that guy was doing by just shuttling him off. But, at the time they told themselves, because they were too famous to be with the general public. So, and this tour goes so bad. I mean, these guys are drunk on stage. They're getting fired from gigs. They're like, by the end of the train tour, like, they don't ride the train home. They end up having to buy plane tickets home because this has just been such a wreck. The plan gets, shuttled, and they end up flying home. And when they get off the plane, Phil Kaufman has to find 3 wheelchairs for the band members because they were, flight sick or airplane sick or whatever. They were just too stoned and drunk and just beyond able to talk by the end of this, weeks of tour, that they're literally just getting shuttled off of airplanes in wheelchairs. So it's just a debaucherous rock star tour. But, which was like, for the fans, not that great, but for the band members, I mean, they looked back on it fondly, I guess. And but anyway, so the Flying Burrito Brothers are, they have a pretty exciting start, but it's debaucherous pretty quick. So at the end of this is where, kind of in this kind of wild time, Graham and his not wife, but I think her name is Bonnie, or is it I think it was Bonnie, is the woman the girlfriend that he swooped from David Crosby, who he has a daughter with. Their relationship falls apart around now. So they never got married, but they are, so they separate. And, it's obviously like a pretty dark time for Graham. He's in a pretty dark place with drugs and alcohol, and now his family's falling apart. But he after that, he kind of starts to pull it together. He ends up getting married to a woman named Gretchen Carpenter. And Gretchen Carpenter seems to have been the best influence on him so far. Like, she's a reasonable human who really did want the best for Graham. And now also at this time, after the first train tour, Graham and geez Louise. The Stones have gotten, closer and closer and closer. And that relationship starts to kind of cause a little bit of a tear in the Flying Burrito Brothers. Because anytime the Stones are in town, Graham's running off and hanging out on their tour bus and, just doing whatever he wants with those guys. And he's like missing shows and he's showing up late to things. And, it becomes clearly contentious. Now, around this time, so Keith Richards had a soft spot for Graham and the Flying Burrito Brothers, obviously. And so around the same time, the Stones had gone on tour and it was a gigantic success. But the main complaint of that Rolling Stones tour is that they had charged so much money for tickets that it was like, inaccessible for big chunks of the fans. That did not stop the crowds from showing up. I mean, the Stones must have made all the money on that deal. But tickets were expensive. So to kind of appease the crowds, they were like, we're going to finish the tour with a free show in San Francisco with all these crazy bands. Like, this is supposed to be a free show. And it was the Rolling Stones, the Grateful Dead, Santana, the Flying Burrito Brothers, and Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. And Jefferson Airplane. Now, at the time when the planning started, Jefferson Airplane and the Stones had kind of had most of the planning going on. Like, that plan was hatched between those guys. And it was supposed to be on December 6th. And the original idea was they were going to have this show in, I think it was Golden Gate Park. And December 4th rolls around, so 2 days before the show, and they can't get permission to do that for all kinds of political reasons, and like the Haight-Ashbury stuff's going on. And so they bail on the Golden Gate Park idea. And the next option was Sonoma Raceway. But the guy that owns Sonoma Raceway doesn't love this idea, but so he wants $100,000 in escrow from the Rolling Stones to put on this show. So the Stones don't like that idea. Well, then the Altamont Speedway becomes the next option, and that guy lets him do it. So just like within 2 days, they set up this music festival, and it is an unmitigated train wreck. Basically, the crowd show up. First of all, Jefferson Airplane and the Rolling Stones hire the Hells Angels to be security, which is a terrible idea. But apparently they had done it in the past, and it wasn't like everything kind of went off without hitch So, and then there's this the next day, there's just hours of radio audio of people calling in and telling the story of what happened the day before, because it was just such a wreck. I mean, people died. It was the whole, like, one guy gets stabbed to death. And so it's, anyway, but when this starts off, the Hells Angels show up, and the seemingly consistent story is that they were just paid in beer. They were given $500 worth of beer to show up and be security, which to them was basically like, sit on the stage, look mean, and don't let anyone get up on stage. And they did that with varying degrees of success as the day went on, and they got drunker and drunker and drunker and meaner and meaner and meaner, to the point where, like, so Santana, I think, opens the show, and it's right off the bat a pretty, rough go. There's fights breaking out, like, right in front of the stage, and, anyway. So then the Burrito Brothers take the stage, and by all accounts, this is one of the only times in this show, with Graham Parsons up there on the stage, when things kind of calm down and everybody starts having a good time again. We're like, there's no fights breaking out. And Keith Richards, credits Graham's personality with it. Like, he was just kind of a calming force. He was very, he understood people. He was able to kind of carry himself in a way where he could kind of exude that calmness. And it did work. Like, a bunch of different people that had nothing to do with each other later report that, like, the Burrito Brothers show was the only part of this that felt normal. Because the opening act was off to a bad start. The Burrito Brothers come on, kind of calm everything back down. Then the Grateful Dead, by the time the Grateful Dead are supposed to go on, they quit. Like, the atmosphere is bad enough. So, like, after the Burrito Brothers go, I think Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young goes on next. And supposedly Stephen Stills is getting stabbed in the leg by one of the Hell's Angels with a bike spoke, just a broke off spoke, and he's just getting stabbed in the, and I don't know what the context, if it was like during the show or like after, I'm not 100% sure about that, but even, the guys that are supposed to be security are apparently stabbing the performers with bike spokes. Like, that's not supposed to happen. And so the atmosphere turns toxic again. Fights are breaking out. Things are getting thrown. One of the Jefferson Airplane guys ends up jumping off the stage into the crowd to like help with a fight that was happening. And he gets clocked and just KO'd by a Hell's Angel immediately. And so like the show kind of goes on, but it's just, the wheels are falling off this thing. And so to the point where the Grateful Dead pull their chute and they leave. And they just say, we're not doing this. This isn't safe. We're not playing this show. So the Grateful Dead, who were like one of the headliners of the show, just pack their stuff and they leave. So by the time the Rolling Stones get on, everything falls apart. They're, and like I said, one guy who's, I have his name here somewhere. Meredith Hunter is his name. Meredith Hunter was a guy in the crowd who ends up getting stabbed to death by one of the Hell's Angels. Now, it turns out he had a revolver. Like, he pulled a gun and tried to walk on stage and get stabbed, which is like, the epitome of stupid games and stupid prizes. But anyway, it's very tragic. This dude dies. Another person died of a drug overdose. Another person drowned in an irrigation canal nearby. Lots of people got trampled and injured. Like, it was an afterthought. There were 300,000 people at this thing, at an event that they put on in 2 days, with the only security force being the Hell's Angels, and their only job was to make sure the stage didn't get messed with. And they didn't even do that right. So, like, it's just an unmitigated disaster by all accounts. And so, but that was another, kind of bump in here where like the Neil Young thing kind of ties in, because Neil Young was there with Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young at the time. So anyway, so that event happens. Everybody kind of moves on. And like I said, the next day there's all kinds of radio traffic about, people are calling into the radio station, like explaining what happened. And even members of the Hell's Angels are like calling in to like give their side of the story, which is nuts. But that's what they did to like, kind of help with the public image, I guess. And anyway, so after that, Graham's relationship with Keith Richards continues to, they continue to be very close, to the point where after that show, Graham and a couple of the guys from the Flying Burrito Brothers end up running to the Rolling Stones trailer, and they stay kind of with the Stones until their time to go up. But then after the Stones are done, Graham ditches the rest of his bandmates, gets on the helicopter with the Stones and leaves. So like, I think there was 2 of them left. And anyway, but Graham leaves in a helicopter with the Flying Burrito Brothers, with the Rolling Stones, leaving the Flying Burrito Brothers behind, which obviously rubbed everybody the wrong way. But that was Graham. He was just going to go with Keith Richards. And he ends up like that relationship, like the more he hangs out with Keith Richards, the more the Burrito Brothers fall apart, because at the time, Keith Richards and Mick Jagger were having all the fun they could pack in, and they were taking any drug that came in front of them and drinking all the booze. And it was just the rock star life over there was at full throttle, to the point where it really starts to affect Graham. He's showing up late to shows. He's missing shows. And when he does show up, he's drunk and just ruining Burrito Brothers concerts. Like to the point where eventually it all comes apart and Chris Hillman punches a hole through the body of Graham Parsons' guitar at one gig. Like he just comes apart, knocks a hole in his guitar, fires him from the Burrito Brothers, which initially Graham is like, you can't fire me. I'm Graham. Like I'm you. We're the same here. And he's like, no, you're fired. Like, get out of here. Like, you've ruined too many shows. You're done. And that's basically the end of the Flying Burrito Brothers, because I shouldn't mention at this point, earlier on, one of their signature things that the Burrito Brothers did in their tenure was they all went and got custom nudie suits, which if you look at so they basically, each member of the band got a custom nudie suit decorated with different things. And Graham Parsons' nudie suit had pills and pot leaves and fire and a cross on his back and like all kinds of it was just drug stuff and slightly religious things and fire all up the leg, which is some weird foreshadowing to, what comes later for Graham. But anyway, so the Burrito Brothers come apart, and Graham goes on to basically, like, he just moves in with Keith Richards. He takes his wife he doesn't move in. They go on holiday together to the south of France, which I don't know why they say the south of France. Why don't we just say South France? I don't understand, but whatever. So they go to the south of France because it sounds fancy. And they just start living like the European posh life where they spend a summer in Keith Richards' house. It's Graham and Gretchen, and then Keith Richards and his girlfriend or wife at the time. And they spend, I think, like a whole summer just lazing around this French estate, cranking out music. So basically, Keith Richards is also recording an album for the Stones, and he'll say that, like, he was basically making 2 albums at the same time, where, like, he would go record with the Stones and write songs there. Then he'd come hang out with Graham all day, and they'd just be playing and writing songs, but that none of that got recorded. So it was just music all day, every day, and drugs and alcohol and whatever else they wanted to do. Just a debaucherous summer. To the point where Graham kind of wears out his welcome with Keith Richards. And that's saying a lot considering what these guys had been through up to this point. So, and it wasn't like, they didn't have like a big falling out, but it was kind of like suggested that, hey man, you ought to get back to, your life, and maybe, it's time for you to move on. And Keith Richards describes it as being like, just, hey, we'll see you in a few weeks. Like, we'll see you in California, go home. And so Graham and his wife leave. Or, well, actually, I don't think they were even married at the time yet. Graham and Gretchen, they get married around this time. And this is where things start to get even a little bit more weird, because when they got married, they go home to Bob Parsons' house. So Bob Parsons is still alive, and he's still raising Graham's, younger sisters. But Bob and Graham's relationship was not great. I mean, he was, obviously, he was the controlling force around the Snively fortune at this point. And there was all kinds of family tension and weird stuff going on. At one point, Chris Hillman, like, Bob shows up in LA looking for Graham at one point, and Chris Hillman describes him as being this just like over the top, wearing like white polished shoes and a plaid sport coat, and he looked like he said he wasn't sure if he was gonna like try to sell him a Buick or something, was the joke that Chris Hillman tells. But anyway, so that's the kind of guy Bob Parsons was. He was just like dressed to the nines, just over the top, rich guy from the 50s. And so Graham and Gretchen get married at Bob's house despite the family tension. It seems like Graham at this point was trying to kind of patch that up a little bit and trying to be around his sisters a little bit and there was some effort going on there. Well, around this time, they end up going on a vacation so Gretchen and Graham go on vacation with Bob and Graham's youngest sister, who describes it like, this is again where like 4 people are on this sailboat and they just go sailing around the Caribbean or something. And you get 4 different stories. 3 different stories. So according to the younger sister, the trip falls apart and Bob kicks Graham and Gretchen off the boat because of drug use. That they brought drugs with them on the trip. They were doing drugs around the younger sister. Bob says you can't do that, kicks them off the boat. That's the younger sister's memory. But Gretchen this is where she described Bob as an evil man. And that's tough. This is decades later, she said Bob was an evil man. Because on this trip, something is said in an argument that leads Graham to the belief that Bob killed Avis, and that interaction at the hospital was in fact Bob's fault. And everyone had suspicions up to then, but it didn't seem to really hit home for Graham until this boat trip. He comes away with the belief Bob killed his mom. Now, there's all kinds of like speculation about exactly how that would have gone down, because she was in the hospital for alcoholism. And this kind of thing happens all the time with addicts for all kinds of different, substances, where a family member will like enable them and bring in the substance that's working on killing them because they feel like they have to for some reason. And so there's the one argument that like that's what it was, that like Avis made Bob bring her alcohol or whatever killed her, and he was just doing what he told her to do. That's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is he did that on purpose because he had this 18-year-old babysitter that he was trying to get married to, and they did soon after. So like all of these things are true at the same time. Avis was a very serious alcoholic. Bob was also an alcoholic. They had a toxic relationship. Bob was running around on Avis with not just the babysitter, but with other people at the same time. But Avis was a force to be reckoned with, and she was kind of the controlling person in that family. Bob visits her in the hospital, probably bringing something with him. She dies. He gets remarried to the new girl almost immediately. So, like, it doesn't mean that it's not for sure he definitely killed her on purpose. He might have killed her on accident, or he might have had nothing to do with this at all. You don't really know. But Graham comes away from that boat ride with the belief that Bob did it on purpose. And they basically never speak again. Like, that's the end of, and Graham never fully recovers. So Graham goes on and he kind of spirals into his, alcohol and drug use. So, but it's during this time that, that Graham starts to kind of have some success on his solo career. And so he moves back to California and he manages to get a record deal. And so this is like one of those weird, like the same thing happened to Hank Williams, where like his health and his performing career was just in the tank, but his recording career was great. Like he was cranking out hits and doing great stuff, but his in-person performing career is just in the dumpster. So this is kind of that phase for Graham Parsons. Now, somehow, at this stage, so Chris Hillman and him have remained friends even after the Burrito Brothers fall apart and Chris punches a hole in his guitar and the whole thing. They remain friends afterwards. And somehow, Chris Hillman became aware of Emmylou Harris, who was just like singing in coffee shops at the time around LA. And when Graham had told him that he wanted a female voice to harmonize with on his solo album, he was like, you got to go check out, this girl. And he ends up giving Graham Parsons Emmylou's number. I don't know how Chris Hillman found Emmylou Harris, but that's the connection. So he gives her the number and kind of has to hound him into calling her. So he does. And that relationship ends up being, a super important part of life for both of those two people. So when Graham calls up Emmylou Harris, she describes it as just like this out of the blue phone call where he was like, oh yeah, like, I'll call you about a recording day. And she was like, all right, but she didn't really expect that to happen. Well, lo and behold, he does call her and he does bring her in and they do start working together and it's great. And, so they start that, then that was called the Fallen Angel albums, which, that kind of the band became known as Graham Parsons and the Fallen Angels, including Emmylou Harris. Now, this is where Emmylou Harris starts to kind of exert and flex her muscles on Graham Parsons' life because she shows up. She's been a solo act this whole time. She gets picked up by these rock stars and she kind of shows up and like everybody's like stoned and drunk out of their minds and nobody's showing up on time and every take has something wrong with it. And it's just a disaster to the point where she starts to be the one that's like, we have to show up on time. We have to get at least one song done today with like, we're going to show up at this time or we're going to leave at this time. Because beyond that, like before that, they were just all hours of the night, kind of sort of recording something. They'd get chunks of a song down and then they'd get, too hammered to stitch anything together. And so it went from being this total chaotic process. Emmylou Harris gets the reins and really gets everybody to work together and gets, the album getting finished at all is really credited to Emmylou Harris for kind of gathering the reins and getting everybody motivated and getting everybody on track. And that album is a big success. And they go on to have, other successes together. Well, they go off on tour. It's called the Fallen Angels Tour. And Phil Kaufman is still the road manager. He recalls that being a train wreck initially also, because while Emmylou was able to get the album done with these guys, she was able to kind of corral them enough for that. The tour was a whole different ball of wax that she had to deal with. They end up getting fired from their first gig, like hooked off the stage, get out of here. Like everyone was just too hammered, missing people. Like the first show is a disaster. But then Emmylou kind of does her thing again and kind of gets the band motivated in the right direction. And by the end of the tour, they're doing really well. And they're getting, like, at one point she said that, I think it might have been the last gig, I don't know. But they got called out for so many encores that they basically just did the show again. That they just had to play the whole set over again because they ran out of material. So they went from, and at this point, this is supposed to be like one of the highlights of Graham Parsons' ability. Like, he's very locked in. He's got his substance use kind of under control, and he's just performing at like his peak ability here with Emmylou Harris. And it's going great. Everything's going good at the end of that tour. So then there's, after the success of the first album, Graham starts working on a second album, and this was called, I think, Grievous, the Grievous Angel, and which would later, if you go back and you listen to that album, it is Graham Parsons' best work. It's got, like, you can hear, if you listen to the albums in order, starting with Sweetheart of the Rodeo, you can see, like, the Graham Parsons' influence starting to bubble up in Sweetheart of the Rodeo, and that sound is in there, but it's not all him yet. And by the time you get to Grievous Angel is everything that he wanted it to be. And it was everything he was trying to be back at Sweetheart of the Rodeo. Like, that's the kind of crescendo as the Grievous Angel album. And same thing, Emmylou Harris is all over that album, singing harmony with him. And things start to kind of go pretty well. And this is the same thing happened to Hank Williams. Things start to go pretty well. And Emmylou is having a pretty positive impact on his life. There's all kinds of rumors that they had more of a relationship than that, but I don't think she's ever come out and said that fully. Like, it, and, you know, Graham was seeing other people at the time. Like, Graham was off doing all kinds of stuff. So basically, around this time, him and Gretchen had separated. They never got divorced, I don't think, but they had separated. And he's living with Chris Hillman in, like, Reseda Beach or something like that. So he moves in with Chris Hillman, and he's working on these albums. Because Gretchen had kind of gotten, like, I don't know if there was ever a romantic relationship between Emmylou and Graham Parsons, but it was enough, like, dynamically to make Gretchen really uncomfortable, because she was just Graham's wife. She didn't have a job related to the band. She wasn't part of the net that, like, you know, part of the gel that held everything together. This band had gotten really tight, and they were really good, and they had kind of learned to be around each other, and that was, you know, they kind of gelled really well, and Gretchen was kind of this third wheel, and that obviously had a big effect. So her and Graham get separated. And at this time, it's not like Graham just jumps into bed with Emmylou Harris. Like, there's another girl that shows up who somehow, I'm not 100% sure how she ends up in LA or how she ends up in this story at all, but she had gone to school with Graham back in high school, back in Florida. And I think her name was Margaret Fisher. And she ends up with Graham when he's separated from Gretchen. But at the same, like, and this is at the same time that he's still working with Emmylou Harris. So that's what makes me think that, like, the fact that Margaret Fisher was there means that there was space between him and Emmylou. So I don't think that was really the problem, but all the other problems were definitely the problem, because Graham starts to kind of backslide again, and he's drinking all the time. Him and Margaret Fisher are just running around doing all the debauchery again. But he manages to get this Grievous Angel album done, and it is widely regarded as his best work. It's his masterpiece. That's, you know, everything Graham Parsons wanted to be. They get the record done. Everybody's happy about it. And Graham calls Gretchen and says, like, I'm going to go out to Joshua Tree and dry out. Now, Joshua Tree National Park was one of Graham's favorite places. He just liked going out to the desert for whatever reason. He liked just the vastness and the emptiness of it. He felt at peace out in the desert. Now, during production of this album, here's the other Byrds tie-in. So when Chris Hillman leaves the Byrds, they replace him with a guy named Clarence White. So this is back, you know, we got to jump back in the timeline a ways here. So Chris Hillman leaves the Byrds and joins the Flying Burrito Brothers. When Chris Hillman leaves, Roger McGuinn hires Clarence White. And Clarence White was widely regarded as one of the best guitar players on the planet at the time. He was like, people held him at the same level. He was like a bluegrass Jimi Hendrix is kind of what people kind of pegged him as. So around this time, during the Grievous Angels production, Clarence White gets killed by a hit and run drunk driver. He's like loading gear into his car. He's like loading his music gear up after a gig, gets nailed by a drunk driver and killed. And Graham Parsons ends up at his funeral. And this is where like the Byrds, you know, lose another member, obviously. Well, I think Chris Hillman ends up back in the Byrds after that happens. So like the Byrds end up having the same original 5 members after 1973, but at the time, this was Clarence White. He had been with them for that gap while Chris Hillman was gone. So Clarence White gets killed. Clarence and Graham knew each other. Like, they were friends and just, you know, in similar circles. And so Graham and Phil Kaufman end up at Clarence White's funeral. And during the funeral, which was apparently a pretty dry event, Graham gets people to start singing hymns, I guess. Like, or some song that, like, Graham kind of takes the reins of this, like, morbid, quiet moment and gets people to kind of sing this, you know, song, and they get the process of this funeral over. But Graham turns to Phil Kaufman and says, "Don't ever let them do this to me. If I die, you burn me and scatter my ashes out in Joshua Tree, because this is not how I want to go." Phil Kaufman, who I haven't quite made up my full opinion of Phil Kaufman yet. For all of his faults, he seems to take a pact with a friend very seriously. Because at the end of the Grievous Angel album, within weeks of Clarence White's funeral, I think it was just a couple of weeks later, Graham calls Gretchen and says, "I'm going out to Joshua Tree. I'm going to dry out. I'm coming home." Like, he promises Gretchen on the phone, "I'm going out there to dry out, and I've got, you know, more to do, and this is the time." So he hits the road out to Joshua Tree. Problem is, Margaret Fisher tags along, and so does Michael Martin, who was another guy they were kind of palling around with, and then his girlfriend. So like I think there's 4 of them that end up going. And they end up at the Joshua Tree Inn, and there is no drying out going on here. Graham ends up it was like it went from "I'm going to go dry out" to "let's go have a last hurrah." And it becomes just a gigantic cluster. I mean, later that night, Graham ends up dying in his hotel room from an overdose of morphine and alcohol. And Margaret Fisher was with him at the time. So, and you get some weird vibes if you go back and look at that. Like, cause she never fully recovered from that, I don't think. Like, she still has that, like, if you watch her describe watching Graham Parsons die, it's dark, because she was there, she watched it happen, and she was kind of powerless to stop it, sort of, but she also might have kind of caused it. So that's a whole nother gray area. So, but Graham dies, and he ends up, you know, kind of putting the end of his career there, and he gets collected by the coroner's office and taken back to Los Angeles. Now, the timeline gets a little weird here, because Graham's body is moved to Los Angeles. I mean, obviously, like, Emmylou Harris was not around at the time. The album had already wrapped. She was already gone. But she would later write a song, "Boulder to Birmingham," which is about Graham Parsons' death. But anyway, so Emmylou is gone. She finds out later. Gretchen, his wife still, goes to the coroner's office, and she does see his body, and she gives him like a kiss goodbye, and then she goes home. And for whatever reason, at this stage of the game, the planning process gets turned over to Bob Parsons, which I don't understand fully why that happened, why it wasn't Graham's wife that was at the helm of the decision-making. But basically, Bob Parsons arranges for Graham's body to be brought back to Louisiana, to New Orleans, to get buried. And this all happens in a really quick succession. And at the time, this was very near Graham's youngest sister's birthday when this happens. So, to the point where they find out about the death, and they, like, don't tell her because they don't want to ruin her birthday party. She finds out later that night because they knew it was going to be in the newspaper later, because, like, Bob flies out. He makes, you know, on the phone, he makes arrangements to have the body flown back to Louisiana, but Bob has to fly out to California to take possession. So while Bob is doing that, Phil Kaufman and Michael Martin just decide that that pact they made at Clarence White's funeral, they meant it. And they borrow, I don't know how you borrow a hearse, but that's the way Phil describes it. They borrow a hearse, dress up to be looking like funeral workers, drive to the LA airport to LAX, somehow manage to find where Graham's body is being held, and they convince the coroner that they are going to fly the body to Louisiana from a private plane at a different airport. And so somehow these two dudes, who were clearly had to be drunk at the time, but they managed to convince the coroner to release the body to them. So they and Phil Kaufman signs the release paperwork as like Gerald Nobody or Jerry Nobody or something, like just like throws a signature on this thing. They get possession of Graham's body, throw it in the back of a hearse that they borrowed. They drive him out into the desert, and they stop at a gas station, and they proceed to fill up the car with, and this part is like wild. If you watch Phil Kaufman describe this, like you kind of get an idea for how his mind worked. They pull up to a gas station, they fill up the car with regular, but they put 5 gallons of high test in a can because Graham deserved the best. They took the time to do an extra transaction to get high octane gasoline in a 5-gallon bucket. They drive their friend out into Joshua Tree National Park, not very far into Joshua Tree National Park, by the way. They get to this like quiet spot that they're like, that'll do. They just pull his coffin out up against these rocks and have like a ceremonial. They dump the 5 gallons of gasoline into the coffin and light it on fire and then leave. Which, I don't know what Phil Kaufman thought it took to cremate somebody, but it's a lot more than 5 gallons of gasoline. So they have this like ceremonial drunken, like, see ya, Graham, strike a match and throw it in the coffin. And then they're, oh, job done. We kept up our end of the bargain. And they like ride off into the sunset. They return the hearse and they like just zero problems with this story at all. It's so wild to watch Phil Kaufman describe this, because he describes it as if he's the good guy in the story, that he like, you know, Graham would have wanted that. And like he goes off at one point talking about how like Bob Parsons just wanted Graham's body back in Louisiana because it was about custody of the Snively estate and blah, blah. He has no idea what he's talking about, because where you're buried has nothing to do with control of whatever estate you're part of. But that's the excuse. And he's kind of indignant about like, yeah, we weren't going to let that happen. Graham wouldn't have wanted that. We weren't going to let that happen. We did what he wanted to do and gave him the funeral out in Joshua Tree. And he maintains that attitude long after this happens. Decades later, he's like, yep, like I'd do it again. The reality is the friends stole his body away from his already traumatized family, drove him out into the middle of the desert, dumped 5 gallons of gasoline on him, and half burned him. It wasn't a cremation. They just burned him. Like, and it was found by campers a couple of days later. So it was like the family who just found out has no idea what's going on. The body's been stolen. There's several days where they don't know where the body is. And then it shows up charred in Joshua Tree National Park, found by some poor traumatized hikers. And it ends up like they end up collecting what's left, which was like 35 pounds of Graham Parsons. And they ship that off to Louisiana. And that's where he's buried. So when you go to Graham Parsons' gravesite in Louisiana, it's what was left of him after his friends lit his body on fire, which is like just insane. To like the fact that they did that and then just didn't even like, they didn't stick around to be like, oh man, this didn't finish burning, we should do more of it, or like whatever. They just kind of struck the match and drove off. And like to this day, see nothing wrong with that, which is, that's where, if you go back and watch interviews with the family, they have much the same attitude as me, which is like, how could you do that? Like what, like there is no honor in this. Like you didn't do anything to help anybody. Graham still ended up buried in Louisiana. You just had to ship less of him. Like how did they, anyway, so the family is obviously very traumatized by it. Only slightly relieved when Phil tells him the story, because they didn't know about this pact with Clarence White, like at the funeral. The family's just like, where the hell did the body go? And later, Phil Kaufman tells him, look, like Graham told me he wanted me to cremate him out in Joshua Tree. And that kind of takes the edge off. So instead of evil, he's just incompetent, I guess. But it's just astounding the level of stupidity and like just recklessness that went into this decision-making process. To the point where later, Kaufman doesn't even get like charged with very much for that. He does get charged. I think he gets charged with like something minor. It was like desecrating a body or something. It wasn't like theft or any of that stuff. It was like improper handling of a body or something. Like, anyway, he gets this like minor charge, and to pay for his fees, he like throws a party and like has a barbecue and like has bands perform to like help him pay for, you know, and everybody seems to think in this circle that like, oh yeah, we got to go help Phil pay it off because the family's mad because he did what Graham wanted him to do. So he's able to like raise money and pay these fees off, which I don't know if anybody at the time knew that the full extent of the story, which is they only did half the job. But anyway, so Phil goes on to have his, you know, happily ever after. As he said, he says, you know, I went off and I lived happily ever after. I'm still living happily ever after. And I don't know if he's still alive now, but so that was his attitude all the way through, which to me was sort of the last metaphor for the music business and what it did to Graham Parsons. Because there was his family that wanted the best for him, and they, you know, kind of tried to draw that out of him. And then there was his friends, the music scene, and the drug use. And the family always got what was left of Graham after that exchange. Graham gave most of himself to the drugs and the drinking and the music, but not to his family necessarily. And they ended up kind of with what's left over, which is kind of ironically exactly the way his body ended up. So, traumatic story for the family, but kind of moves on into legend. And like I said, Emmylou Harris goes off to have a crazy successful career of her own. She's still doing the thing, you know, she's still performing and making records, and she's, you know, she became a big, you know, artist in country music and pop music. Like Emmylou Harris goes on to be a legend of her own. We'll probably do a video on Emmylou Harris at some point. But yeah, and then Boulder to Birmingham, if you go back and look up that song, that's Emmylou writing about Graham Parsons. So just a cool guy who had a crazy influence on music. Actually, something I missed here, the song Wild Horses that the Rolling Stones did, they actually let the Flying Burrito Brothers record that first, even though Keith Richards says that he wrote that song before he ever met Graham Parsons, but Graham Parsons is still credited with like introducing Keith to country music. But that's the most country music song that the Rolling Stones ever did. They just let the Flying Burrito Brothers record that like before they did. So the first version of Wild Horses is the Burrito Brothers. And so they kind of had other effects. And also the bass player ends up, for the Flying Burrito Brothers, ends up in the Eagles. He ends up playing bass for the Eagles and like ends up, and he says, you know, like Graham Parsons' influence was all the way there. Like the Eagles sound, Graham had an effect on that. He had an effect on Emmylou Harris. He had an effect on, even Dwight Yoakam will say that like I think he said any of his success is a reflection of Graham Parsons' influence, which is you know, for Dwight Yoakam to say that is, you know, high praise, as they say. But, so yeah, just a giant impact on rock and country music and folk music, and just kind of this character that just slid around never broke big and became super famous on his own, but just had a crazy impact on everybody around him and left behind a crazy story. So that's Graham Parsons. So thank you everybody for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.